Hey, what is up everyone? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we will be diving into the exciting world of cloud deployment. We will be taking our full stack application and seamlessly deploy it to the cloud, where we will be able to access it on our own custom domain. But first, let's talk about the cloud provider and the sponsor of this video, Hostinger. Hostinger is a reliable and user-friendly platform that offers a range of powerful hosting solutions. By setting up a virtual private server with Hostinger, we will have the perfect environment to run our applications smoothly. We will also be using Hostinger to set up our domain. Now you might be wondering, how are we going to simplify the deployment process? That is where Dokku comes into play. Dokku is a fantastic piece of software that simplifies the deployment of applications. It is a lightweight tool and easy to use, and seamlessly integrates with popular tools and frameworks. In the previous two videos, we've been working hard on developing our full stack application. And today, we're going to bring it all together and deploy it to the cloud using Hostinger and Dokku. By the end of this video, you will have a solid understanding of the deployment process and be able to apply it to your own projects. So without further ado, let's dive right in and learn how to deploy a full stack application to the cloud using Hostinger and the power of Dokku. Okay, so we want to deploy our full stack application. So let's actually go ahead and launch it locally and walk through some basic stuff that we're on the same page. And then we move to Hostinger, where we will set up our virtual private server, install Dokku, and then do the deployment from our local computer. So let's actually get this running. So for this project, it's a full stack application. We're using Node.js and Express for our API and PostgreSQL for our database. Then we have a front-end application running Next.js, and yeah, let's actually get it running. So I'm just quickly going to start up everything. Let's get the Docker Compose up for the Postgres, and then we can run yarn develop to start our API, and we can see everything is connected. And then we can run yarn dev for our let's just add that yarn dev for our Next.js application. And then once this is all started up, let's head over to the browser where we will view the application. Okay, so in the browser on localhost 3000, port 3000, we can see our front-end application loading up our posts. We can see we have this create new. If you want to build this application along with me, you can go and view my previous videos in this series, where we built the front end and the back end. So here we can see the backend response. It's showing us our JSON. And if we want to get a specific post, let's get that number. We can view that number, and then we can do all the CRUD operations. So it's a very basic API, a very basic front end. And now we're going to take this and we're going to deploy it to the cloud on its own domain. So we're going to have our domain postnet.tech for the front end, and we're going to set our API on a subdomain of the domain that we're going to buy. So it's going to be api.postnet.tech. So yeah, it's going to be very exciting. There's a lot to learn. So let's dive right in. Okay, so back to our Visual Studio Code. I'm just going to stop all the servers here, and I want to walk through some of the important stuff. I'm going to close off this Docker containers. Cool. Networks are down. Okay. So I made a few changes if you were following along with the previous two builds for the front end and the back end. So the changes in the back end is with regards to the configuration. So when we do the database connection, we previously had the string directly in here. So I just changed it to point to the keys object. And in the keys object, instead of having all the Postgres parameters, I've just created env that points to the env file for the database URL. And if we look in the env file, we can see we have the database URL in the form of a string. So it kind of contains all the information we had previously. So if I highlight this information, you can see it being highlighted in the string. So this is just a string representation of all of this information. So connecting to the database is set up like this now. And then inside of the index.js, I've added in some more origins to the core's middleware. So this will become important when we set up the domain and the IP address of our server. So I'll get back to this as soon as we get there. So this is just some of the changes. And then inside of the package.json, I've just added in these two scripts, which are important for the deployment process. So when we deploy, we will need a start script. And this start script should obviously be the script that runs your application. So I've added in the development one, which uses NodeMon, and then the start script just uses Node to run the application. So that's the changes on the back end. On the front end, the only changes that I've made is I've moved my API URL. Instead of having it just the string like this inside of the keys object, I've actually moved it to an environment variable for the Next.js application as well. And accessing environment variables in Next.js, it is important to name it with this prefix and then the name of the key. Okay, so this is how we will be able to access this key throughout our app, is through the keys objects. And then you can see in our services, when we use the base URL to set up our Axios interceptor, or not our Axios interceptor, but our Axios instance, then we use the API key from this keys object. Okay, so now that we've covered all of the changes in the application, let's go ahead and move to Hostinger's website, where we will be looking at the server that we will be setting up with them. Okay, so this is Hostinger's homepage. So we can off the bat see an extremely cheap price. So that is a very cool benefit of Hostinger. They have very good pricing and they have very good servers. I've been testing it out for the past month and it's been working quite good. I'm quite impressed, and specifically for the price range, it is actually quite impressive. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the tab that we need to be exploring, which is these virtual private servers. So we can see we have different types of hosting options. If we actually take a look at this option here, we can see we have web hosting, they have their own website builder, cloud hosting, WordPress hosting, and then hosting for professionals. We will be using the virtual private server hosting, which is nice for the setup of hosting full stack applications and controlling it like we want to. Then we have cyber panel hosting and Minecraft server. We have some email services and the domain services, which we will be using as well to buy and set up our domain. So let's take a look at this virtual private server hosting page. And here we see a few different tiers. So hosting plans, and there are different tiers of the server. So this server gets 1 GB of RAM, and it's the virtual private server 1. And then it goes all the way up to the virtual private server 8, which gets like a big machine. You get like a 16 GB RAM, which is pretty much a laptop, and a very good storage, good transfer in and out bandwidth, and one snapshot. And then, yeah, you get all the good jazz. And these prices are very good. You can see that these prices, I mean, paying $80 for a month for a computer on the internet, and it has like maintenance and everything connected to that. That's actually a very good price. So let's take a look. One thing to note with Hostinger's sales is they like to sell things in bundles. So you take things up almost like a bundle for 12 months or 24 months and so forth. So if we take a look at this, we can see we have the 12-month bundle, which are all on the same special, but it's just important to read some of these smaller text. When something renews, the price kind of goes up after a certain date of purchase. But for the first year, I believe it's the $6, and then it kind of incrementally increases as you go. So in 2025, it will be $9.50. But you can see that you kind of save a lot of money, right? So that's very good. If you want to just go month to month, it's $13, which is also quite competitive to other cloud providers out there. You do have some setup fee, so they kind of lean towards selling it in these bundles, which actually turns out to be quite cheap. So then we can go to the select payment method, quite a few payment methods, and then we enter in our details. We selected our plan, which is the 4 years plan, and then we can see our discount amount over here and the total amount in cash that we get discount. You can click the link at the top of the description where you will get a 10% discount, and then you can use the coupon code FULLSTACKJUNKIE, all in capital letters, and if you use this coupon code you will get an extra 4% discount, and then with the link down below. So it's quite a lot of discount if you're starting out, so do use that and support the channel. Okay, so this is how you would go ahead. You would enter in your card details. I'm not going to do this now as I've already bought a virtual private server plan 2. So I've actually bought this same plan only for a year. And yeah, so let's actually log into the Hostinger panel and look around at what we can do with this virtual private server panel. Okay, so here we are logged into the Hostinger panel. So we can see it's the H panel of Hostinger. And we've got a few tabs up here. We will be using the domains and the virtual private server tab. You can also see some quick access here. So I've already purchased a domain, but I'll step you through on how to do it. Hostinger has a really great user experience on their website, so it's very easy to understand what to do. But when we set up the domains and we work with A records, I'll explain all of that. And working with the server is already set up. Once you actually bought the server, you can go through a setup almost like this. You get the setup yellow button, and then you step through a form to set up your first server. Everything is configurable afterwards. I won't be able to go through that step-up form with you, but like I said, it's very, very simple. Just read. They broke up the steps in small parts, so it's very easy to understand. I think it's like 5 or 6 just steps that you have to go through. Adding an SSH key is one of them, so that's important. If you don't know how to do that, do a quick Google video and you'll find out that quickly. So let's take a look at the Manage tab over here. And it's a quite simple dashboard, but we have all the information that we need. We can see virtual private server information, SSH access, and then plan details. So we can see the specifications of the plan. I've bought the virtual private server 2. And on what date and the specifications. We have our SSH information. So this will be the SSH root command to actually enter our server. And then we can see the IP address, it's running, how long it's been up and running, and then some of the overview statistics of this virtual private server. We have different tabs here. I'm just going to quickly flash through some of them. We have settings. We have services where you get some more stats. Then we have snapshots and backups, so you can view some backups and do a snapshot. We have some actions, so you can see I've been recreating the server quite a few times in testing and in preparation for this video. So that's the thing that I'm going to do, and I just reinstalled the operating system, pretty much clearing the virtual private server and rebooting it to a new fresh instance. So we can take a look. The virtual private server is running Ubuntu. So here we can choose any of these operating systems. I've chosen the latest version of Ubuntu, and then I just hit reinstall. Then we have licenses and help. So it's a very simple panel, but from here we will be able to view all the information that's needed. So let's actually copy this now, and then we're gonna log into our server and start getting dirty. Okay, so here we have our terminal open. So I'm just using PowerShell, the new PowerShell of Windows, and I'm going to paste in this SSH root and our server IP command. This will then prompt us with setting up your fingerprints for accessing on this SSH key, and we just give it a yes, thumbs up, and now we are inside of our server. I'm just clearing the terminal to get everything clean, and let's take a look. So if I type in the command, who am I? We can see we are the root user and we are logged in. So this is all good. Now we want to start moving towards setting up the deployment software that we will be using, and that's called Dokku. Let's actually go to the website now and take a look at what Dokku actually is. So if we actually take a look at the homepage of Dokku, we can see this term popping up platform as a service and Heroku. So what is Dokku and what does it have to do with Heroku? Well, it actually gives you the same functionality for deployments as you have with Heroku. So if you actually are a Heroku user or have heard about Heroku, it helps you to deploy your applications in a very similar way. Underneath the hood, Dokku uses Docker containers to manage and deploy your applications, and this has a lot of benefits because Dokku is built very smart, so it helps you to scale up your applications, it helps you to deploy using Git, and it helps you to configure proxies and domains and a lot of other stuff. So we can see some of the important plugins. We have Let's Encrypt to set up SSL certificates, and then we have CouchDB, we have PostgreSQL, Redis, and some very other cool popular technologies. So we will be setting up our database and our Let's Encrypt using Dokku to manage these Docker containers. So I would say a prerequisite to maybe getting a little bit better at using Dokku would be to learn a little bit of Docker. If you don't have any experience with Docker, that's okay. Using the Dokku CLI is pretty straightforward and you can get a lot done from that point. But if you want to dive in learning Docker, that would always be a benefit for your deployment career. Okay, and then we just see the supporters. So let's dive into the getting started, where we will then, I'm not going to read all of this. I've been through this documentation. I would highly suggest just take a read of each section that you might be working on or have questions, and then I think the documentation would give you your answers. So we're going to copy this command. So it's pulling in a bootstrap.sh command file from the Dokku URL, and it's the version 0.30.5. And then we're going to run the command to actually run this bootstrap.sh that we're downloading. Okay, so let's copy this command and let's head over to our terminal. I'm just going to paste this in here. So what this is going to do, it's downloading the script. And then once it's downloaded, we are going to clear the terminal and copy the next part of the script, or this part will actually run this bash script. Okay, and then we run the script, and this is going to take some time, right? Because it's going to go through this bootstrap.sh file. I would suggest, if you're interested, taking a look at what's inside of the bootstrap.sh file. You'll see it's a load of if statements and just some bash scripts to actually run this installation of Dokku on any server. It's checking whether we have the right dependencies. It's checking that our application software is actually updated correctly. And yeah, it's kind of doing a lot of the setup stuff for us. So it's quite easy getting set up. One thing to note, this is actually going to fail. And the reason for this is during the installation step with Dokku, we are installing a software called Nginx. And Nginx is a reverse proxy, a web server, or a load balancer. And this server that Hostinger provides us with actually comes pre-installed with Apache 2, which is a competitor to Nginx. So they are kind of going to clash at the end. Once it starts downloading the Nginx and setting up the Nginx configuration, it will actually crash. I would actually encourage you to go ahead and read some of this output that it spits out. You can see all of the interesting technologies. For example, you can see it running Docker here, and here it's starting to install a lot of Docker images. And these Docker images are called the Heroku images. And that's actually an interesting topic, which we will dive in a little bit deeper in some other video where we do a deep dive on Dokku. But it's pretty much just some images that gives our applications an environment to build and deploy in. So it's preset up Heroku, preset up Node, or preset up images to run different types of applications. So it picks up what technology your application requires, and it probably has some Heroku-ish build pack to run or deploy your app. So for JavaScript applications, Heroku-ish images are perfect because it's able to build pretty much any JavaScript or Node application. So I'm going to actually pause this, and once this gets to the failed screen, I'll get back to you. Okay, so here we are greeted with the error screen. So it's kind of done all of its installations and setup, and then launching the Nginx service, it actually fails. So during some debugging, I actually then found out about the Apache 2 software. So let's actually go ahead and first, once we clear this terminal, let's go ahead and delete or uninstall this Apache software. So we're just going to run a few commands. So let's run this first command. We have sudo system control stop. So we're going to stop this Apache service. And once that is stopped, we are then going to run this command to actually purge or uninstall or remove all of these different packages of Apache 2. So doing that, we will get prompted, are you sure you want to do this? And we're just going to say yes. And this should then sort our problem. So this is all good. Now we should be able to run our very last command just to clear out all of the auto remove. So it just clears out any of the packages that's not required. So let's just say yes. Okay, that's all done. Let's clear the terminal. So let's rerun our Dokku script. So I'm hitting up arrow key to get back to this part, and it's going to run through that bash file once again, and then it's going to determine it's set up all of the stuff and downloaded all of the required technologies, and now it just needs to run the Nginx part again. So let's actually do that, and once we get to the success screen, we should have a successfully running Dokku. So let's run this command and let's see if it works. Here we can see it upgraded the Nginx binary and it's doing some launches with Docker. It's quite interesting to see all of these stuff go off, and we should see at the end, here we've got the prompt telling us to set up our Dokku SSH admin key. So we'll get to that in a sec, but this means we've got Dokku set up on our server. So let's actually try it out. So how do we access Docker? I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, and we access Dokku, not Docker, we access Dokku with the Dokku command. On the server, we can use the Dokku command, and if we run this, we can see a listing of all the Dokku commands that we have access to. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit, and we can see we have quite a few. Some of them we won't be touching in this video, but take a look at them. It's quite interesting. You can do a lot of different things with Dokku. The ones we will be using, let's take a look at them, is the apps, where we will be managing Dokku apps. We will be using the domains, where we will be managing domains and the proxies. So then we'll have the Git one, which is also an important one to manage Git deployments. And we have logs. The help command is also always useful. It can be used for any of the other commands. So we can use the help command on top of the git command to view how to use the git command. Then we're going to use this proxy command and the ps for processes command. And then we have this SSH key command, which we just saw at the top. And we'll actually start off by adding our SSH key to the Docker user. So let's actually do that. So let's use our first Dokku command to set up a SSH key. So let's inspect how to use this command. So we can say SSH keys, and then we want the help. So I must have mistyped SSH keys. And then we can see the listing manage public SSH keys used for deployment. So we can add different people's public SSH keys so that they have access to deploy, or we can add SSH keys for some CI/CD pipeline to deploy to the server. So it's quite useful. So let's actually set up our SSH key. So during the setup of most virtual private servers with cloud hosters, they add your SSH key in the following folder. So we can say cat, and then we can log out from the root directory we are in, the SSH folder, the hidden folder, and then we want to log out the authorization keys. So this is a file, and then inside of this file, we have our public SSH key for which we added in the beginning when we set up the virtual private server. So I'm not going to log this out. It is a public key, but that's fine. So I'm going to pipe this to the Dokku command. So let's actually run the Dokku SSH keys, and we want to run the command where we set a new key. So let's actually scroll up and look at the command that it wanted us to run. If we are still able to see it from here, yes, we can see it says echo the contents of your underscore ID RSA pub file. So and then we pipe this to the SSH keys, and then this colon add, and then we give it a name of admin. So we can give it any name, but let's just give it a name as well. So the command SSH keys add, and we give it a name of admin, and we run this, and it just outputs a command like this, letting us know that it has set up a SSH key for our computer. So what does this mean? What did we just do? Well, we just allowed our local computer, so my computer I'm recording this on, to deploy to Dokku on this remote server, on this virtual private server. So we've allowed our computer to access Dokku and deploy actually from our local computer to Dokku on this virtual private server. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so now that we've set up our SSH key for deployment, and we've inspected our first command, let's actually go ahead and create our first Dokku apps. So what does this mean, a Dokku app? Well, it's any application that you want to run through and manage through Dokku. So we want to run two applications. We want a front end and a back end, and we want a database, but we'll get to the database in just some time. So let's actually first set up these two apps, our front end and our back end. How do we do this? Well, we can say Dokku, and then we use the apps command, and then we can inspect it once again by using help. And this is always useful to just do this, to take a look, what options do we have? So we're going to use the create command to create a new app, and then we should specify the app name. So I'm going to clear this again. So Dokku apps, and we want to use the create command and give it a name of Node API. So our first application will be the Node API, and we can see it created the Node API. So now if I want to use another command, we can say Dokku apps and then report. So this gives us a report of all of our apps, and we can see some basic information about the first app that we have here, which is the Node API, when it was created, the deployment source. So we currently see it's empty because there's nothing deployed here yet. And then we can see the directory. It created its own directory. In the home directory, in the Docker directory, it created a Node API directory. So Dokku kind of does all of this stuff behind the scenes for us using this CLI. So this is actually pretty neat and very nice to use. So if you've checked out my previous deployment video where we just deployed a Node server, we had to manually go and do all of these stuff, right? Set up Nginx, set up all of the ports, and actually create the directory ourselves. So now we're kind of doing it on a next step. So let's create our next app, which is actually the next app. So let's call our new app next app. So we once again running this command. So doing the report, we can now see two applications, and you can create and launch as many applications as you want on Dokku. It's very, very cool. So Dokku, one thing to note, we do something called vertical scaling. So we are not adding more servers, we are just making our server bigger in order to handle these applications. So now we have our two applications. What is another concept that's important in Dokku? Well, it's the configs. So if you look at the command configs and we just run the help, whoops, I can spell help. There we can see all of the commands here. Just zoom out a little bit. And we have bundle, clear, export, get, keys. So what does this do? Manage global and app-specific config variables. So any of the configuration variables we have inside of our .env files. So let's go to our Visual Studio Code. And what these configs are any of these variables that we've added inside of our .env files inside of our projects in order to run or connect to servers or stuff like that. That is what we set with the Dokku config command. So it's actually a very important command. So let's actually set up some configurations which are important for our apps. So let's think about the ports. We need to set up port information for both of our apps. So we can say Dokku config, and then there's a set command, And then we need to specify the app name, which is Node API. And we can specify a comma separated list of different environment variables. So the first environment variable is a port, and I want to set that equals to port 3001. So that's the first one I want to add. Then we can add with just not comma separated, sorry, just enter separated or space separated list. And then we can add a new environment variable. I'm just going to add this one. We can see it set the environment variable and it tried to restart the app, but there was no app found because we haven't deployed anything yet. So it kind of does all of these steps for you in the background, which is very nice. Okay, let's do this same thing, but for the next app. So let's get the next app spelled out here. And then we want to add it, but not to port 3001, but to port 3000. So the same as our local running environment, right? We're just kind of trying to mimic it up here for the ports and get things running. So doing that, it's trying to reboot, it set it. So let's actually log out our configs for each of the app to see what we already have. So we can do that by saying config and then show. So this one doesn't have a report command, but we can use the show command. And then here we can show the Node API app. And then we can see it has one environment variable, which is the port. And then we can do the same for the next app. And voila. So this is very cool. The next thing which is important is actually setting up the domain. So this I'm going to cover a few times in this video, but pretty much the domain means whenever our server gets a request on a specific domain. So we get subdomains, we get just full domains, and then we get domains with different routes. So when we hit a domain, we can point to different apps. So for example, our application, our Node API is going to be accessible on the endpoint API and then our domain name .com. So this API in the front, this is the subdomain. So we want to access our Node API on some subdomain, but we don't have a domain name yet. So let's don't jump there yet. So let's first set up our domain for our applications only using our IP address of our server. So we can do this in Dokku by setting the domain. So let's actually inspect the domains. So I'm just going to hit the report command here. We can see the domains for two applications. We get this default set domain and it's just taking the domain of our server. So when you set up the server, it asks you to set up a name. So we just gave our domain this name, which is arbitrary. But we want to set up our own server one. So let's actually remove this global domain first. So I'm going to say Dokku domains and then remove. So this is another command, remove global. And then what one I want to remove? I want to remove it from the Node API, and the full stack deploy, I want to remove this one. So we can see it removed it from the Node API. So let's do the same for the next app. Okay, so now we've removed it from both. So let's log out, report it again. So we can see we've removed this global vhosts. So now we want to set this property to be equal to our server IP. So if we head over to Hostinger, we can get our server IP from there. So heading to our virtual private server dashboard, we can see our IP address over here. We can copy that and head back. And now we can use the Dokku domains. And let's just use the help command to see what we can work with here. We want to use this set command. We want to set a new domain for a specific app. So let's clear that. And we want to use the Dokku domains set command for the Node API. We want to set it equals to this IP address. And it's going to set that for us. We have no application running, so it doesn't need to redo any Nginx configuration. So we can do this for the next app as well. Doing this setup try and understand what it is we're actually doing, right? We're setting up a domain now. So if any request comes into our server on our root IP address, then we are pointing it to both of our apps currently, right? But there's one thing we're gonna need to configure is the port. If we specify our IP address with a specific port, let's say the port 3000, then it should point to our front end. If it points to the port of 3001, it should point to our backend. So how do we do that routing? Well, it's called setting up a proxy. We are proxying the request from one port to another port. And we do this with the Dokku command. So let's clear this again, the Dokku proxy command. So let's log out here. So manage the proxy integration for apps. So underneath what it's doing, right, is it's configuring our Nginx to route to different applications or different ports depending on what the endpoint or what port gets hit or what subdomain gets hit. So this is actually pretty cool. So let's look at the ports set command. So we want to set a specific proxy port mapping for an app. So we want to map some port to an app. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So let's say Dokku proxy, and we want to proxy set ports. I think it's ports. Oh no, I can't remember. Let's actually log it out again. So it's the Dokku proxy ports set, and then we specify the app name, which is the Node API. And then we have this schema. We can see this type of setup. Well, the schema, it means HTTPS or HTTP. We have different types of schemas, right? So the one we're going to set up is HTTP. And what host port? So on our machine, when we visit this host port, to what container port should it be mapped? So if you're familiar with Docker and the mapping of containers and their ports, this is doing the same thing, right? But just through Dokku. So we want to map anything coming in for the API on this endpoint on our host machine and map it to that same port on our Docker container machines for this specific app, the Node API app. So doing this, it will configure an environment variable. We can see it added an environment variable actually that explains this mapping. So this environment variable is prefixed with Dokku, which means Dokku actually uses this to handle some different setups for us as well. So let's do the same thing, but on the port 3000 on the host machine and on the Docker container, but this time for the next app. So our front end will be accessible with this proxy setup. So if we do this and log it out, this is all good. Let's actually go ahead and report all of our proxy information. So I'm going to report this out, and we see all of our apps. We are using the proxy type of Nginx. Proxies is enabled, and we have these different port mappings. So now that we've set up our domain to point to our IP address, and we've done the proxies to point to our different applications based on their ports, we can now actually go ahead and deploy our applications to the server from our local computer. So this is where the exciting part comes. So we kind of have done some setup. One thing we can still do, we can set up the database. So in order to deploy our backend is going to need to be able to connect to a database to do a successful deployment. So let's set up a database now. So if I were to just run the Dokku command, right at the end, okay, we actually don't see any, so we see this list of commands, but if I were to add a new thing called a plugin to Dokku, which is going to be the Postgres plugin, we can access and do containerized Postgres commands through Dokku. So let's actually visit a GitHub repo for this Dokku Postgres plugin. I've navigated to the GitHub page, and this is for the Dokku Postgres plugin. So we can see the official Postgres plugin for Dokku, and we can install it by running this command. So this is pretty much just adding, it's using the Dokku command, which there is a plugin command for, and then we're installing from this GitHub root, and we're calling it the Postgres service. So if we take this and we copy it, and we go to our server's terminal again, and we paste this in, and run, we can see it is cloning down the repository Postgres and adding it to our Dokku group. And we're once again pulling down some Docker images. This is actually downloading the Postgres Docker image. So if you have watched my previous videos on where we built a Node API using Docker and PostgreSQL, take a look at it, then a lot of this would make sense what's happening, right? It's now actually downloading the Postgres and some other useful libraries as well, some other useful BusyBox image, yeah, a few things. So this is done. Now we can run the Dokku command again. Now we should see community plugin commands, and we have this Postgres plugin for managing Postgres service. So now this is going to be so easy, right, to set up a Postgres database on our server. All we need to do is say Dokku Postgres, and let's say help to view what we can do. There's a few commands we can do with the Postgres command, but the one we need is the create. We want to create a new Postgres service. And then we're going to use this link command to link it to one of our apps. And all that that's doing, right, is it's just setting up some Docker networking related stuff, and it's adding an environment variable, that database URL that we added in on our local computer. It's adding it to our app environment configs. So let's actually go ahead and say Dokku Postgres and create our new Postgres DB. So let's call it PGDB. So this is our Postgres instance name. And doing that, it's getting a container ready and it's going to set up a Postgres database. So here we can see some of the information logged out. We can see some of the configuration strings and statuses. And then one thing it did, once we launched the following, so we can say Dokku Postgres and the link command, we want to link the PGDB, which is the name of our database service, to our Node API. So doing that, we can see it's set an environment variable called the database URL to our configs. So this is doing all of the stuff that we actually would have needed to do, right? It's doing it automatically by just running a few commands. So yeah, this is pretty interesting. So now we've set up all of that. The last thing we need to do is inside of our front end. So let's head over to our application so I just don't do stuff unnecessarily. So we've set up this port. We don't need to set up this information because we are only looking for this URL, and we just set that URL when we link the database. And then for our front end, we are going to need only one environment variable, and it should be called next public API URL. So let's go ahead and set that in order for this to work. So let's say Dokku config, and let's just show the Node API just to confirm. We can see we have this database URL, we have some Dokku variables, and we have the port for the server setup. So you can see this mapping of the port numbers matches. So now let's actually check the next app and what we have to work with here. And we can see we don't have that next API set up. So let's do that. For the next app, I want to set a new config. And I want to set it equals to this variable, which is the next public API. And our API will be accessible for now on the following link. So we're going to use our database URL. So we can grab that from here. And it's going to be accessible on a specific port. So we're looking for the API's port, which is 3001. So this is how we will access our API from our next app. So setting this environment variable, now we should have everything set up to actually deploy our applications. So let's go ahead and do that now. So let's close down these files. And the first thing we need to do, I'm going to actually open up one terminal for each of our applications. So we have a terminal open for our backend, and we have a terminal open for our front end. So let's zoom in a bit here. So in order to deploy this from here, we need to set up a Git remote repository. And instead of pushing to a remote repository like GitHub, we are pushing to the Dokku instance on our Hostinger virtual private server. So if you think of Heroku, so previously with Heroku, you would also deploy to some cloud origin. And this is the same thing. We need to set up that origin for Dokku. And how do we do this on our local project? So you obviously need to have Git installed, and then you need to create a Git repository for both of the projects. So if you take a look at Git status, we can see we have a Git repository in both of the applications. So that's important. Create a Git repository for both your applications. Now we need to add a Git remote. So we're going to say Git remote add. Let's actually zoom in a little bit here. We're going to say Git remote add, and we're going to give this remote a name called Dokku. And then we're going to we can call this name anything. We can call it DK or just Dokku. And then we need to specify some login. So how do we do that? Well, it's important. We need to use the Dokku user to enter our server. And then we need to specify our server IP address. So we have this @ So previously when we SSH'd into our server, we said root at the server IP, but now we're saying Dokku because during the installation of Dokku, it created a Dokku system user, and now we're logging in during the deployment in with that Dokku user. That's why we needed to set up the SSH key for Dokku. So now we're logging in as that user and we are deploying to a specific application. But how do we know to what application we are deploying here? Well, we don't. So we need to specify the Node API. So :Node API. So this we are setting up a remote called Dokku, which uses the Dokku login for our server, and then we use and deploy to the Node API. So running this, it just set up a remote. So if I were to log the Git remote, we can see we have this one remote called Dokku. Now we can do the same thing for the front end. So Git remote add Dokku, and then we have the Dokku user at our server IP, and then here we are deploying to the next app, and we've set up that remote. So now set that up. Now it's very, very simple to deploy our application, right? All we need to do, and this is where the magic starts, right? I'm gonna enlarge the terminal and close everything up, and we're just gonna say git push, and we're gonna push to the Dokku origin, and we wanna push to the master branch. So if we had a main branch over here, so we can see this is the master branch. If we want to deploy, let's say, a different branch on our local machine, we specify that branch first. So let's say we deploy the development branch. And for Dokku to deploy and automatically deploy your application, we need to push to the master branch. So it's automatically deploying any pushes to the master branch. So in this case, everything is called master. So we can just hit the master branch, and if we run this, we should start seeing some Heroku-like outputs. So this is very, very cool, and it's actually deploying our Node server. We can see it's loading some environment variables. It's creating our runtime based on this Heroku-ish image, and it's starting to do our deployment. So let's actually wait for this. We can see the build was successful. And we didn't set up anything we didn't set up Node on the server. It automatically picked that up from the deployment process because we are using Node and JavaScript. Dokku kind of blends with that very, very nicely. It supports a load of other platforms to deploy as well. So looking at the documentation for your specific language might be useful. So we can see it now reloads the Nginx, and it's rebuilding everything and relaunched our containers and renamed our containers, and we have deployed our application. So now we can actually access our API on this URL. So you can see everything is logged out according to the domains we set up in Dokku. We set up this as the domain and this as the proxy for our app. So now we should be able to access it on this URL, right? So let's actually try and do that. So I'm gonna head over to the browser here. Gonna open up this tab, and I'm gonna go to the server IP and then the port 3001. And we can see the text being outputted, API is running. So this is very, very cool, right? We just launched our application so seamlessly and so easy to the cloud on an IP address and forwarding the ports and everything. So I can view our posts, and there we can see all of the posts that was created with our starting script. If you followed along with building the API, then all of this would look familiar to you. So we have all of our endpoints or all of our posts being listed, so we can see the database is working. It actually connected to the database and actually uploaded all of the stuff. So that's very sweet. We can view the individual posts just like that. So let's actually deploy our front end. This is just as easy, right? So let's head over to Visual Studio Code and let's go to the front end tab, and let's do the same thing. Git push Dokku master, and it's as easy as that. We're gonna now launch up our next build, and you can see it's doing a next app build for the Heroku's build. It's picking up, we are detecting that it's a Node application. It requires Node to build and run this environment, which is correct. We need Node to run a next app, and then it goes ahead and installs Node, the latest version of Node, and Yarn and NPM. So just a very, very cool tool. Yeah, for the next deployment, it may take a little bit of more time because it first needs to statically build all of the outputs for Next. So I'll get back to you as soon as this deployment is done. Okay, so here we're getting to the end of the build for Next. This is the output. We can see it has built all of the pages. So this is very cool. We're actually seeing all the processes and all the steps that it's taking to deploy our application. So if you wanted to deploy a Next application, you would first need to run the yarn build command, which actually goes ahead and creates all of these pages and determines whether it's server-side rendered or statically created. And yeah, it loads all of your assets in a very performant way and does some caching for rebuilds. And yeah, now it's at the caching build step, and we can see the build has succeeded. And this concept for the type web, once we do the deep dive into Dokku in the next videos, we will be looking at this concept of scaling. We will be able to scale something like our API very easily with Dokku, just creating another instance of our API and doing load balancing across multiple instances very, very smoothly and easily using Dokku. So as we can see, our web count is only 1, but we can start up multiple processes. We can add web 10, and it has 10 different instances running. So it takes a 10-second pause and then it deploys everything. Here we re-trigger some Nginx proxy rebuilds, and where our application is deployed on this URL, we can actually just click here to open it. Open this, and it opened it in this tab over here. And we can see our front end being hosted. So this is very, very, very cool, and it's hosted on our domain or on our IP address of our server. But now we want to actually set up our own domain name. We don't want to access it on this and specify ports and stuff like that. We want to access our front end on a domain name, and we want to access our API on a subdomain name. So how do we set this up? Well, it's very easy with Hostinger and very easy with Dokku. So let's take a look. Okay, so back on the Hostinger panel page, we now need to access this domain dashboard. So let's go and manage our domains. So now I'm going to manage the postnet.tech domain. If you want to get your own domain, it's quite easy. We just go to domains, and then we see a list of all the domains that we have. So currently I only have one domain, but you can buy a new domain by saying get domain. You search for your domain and view the price, and the checkout is quite easy to explain. You can use the coupon code there as well. So that's all good. Let's go back to our domains, managing our domains, go to Postnet, and let's take a look at the dashboard. We can see some of the information. It was active, when it was verified, when it expires at, and that you can renew it. We have some secret keys and the name servers. We can do an auto renewal. A few things here. It's quite clean, very, very easy to understand dashboard. Then we have the DNS or name server records. So here is where we configure some records on our domain. And what does this mean, right? Setting up different records. Well, the important one and the only one you need to worry about for this video setup is the A record. And the A record pretty much just points to any IPv4 IP address. So the triple A or the four A's, this is for IPv6 address. So we are pointing our domain name. So when someone accesses postnet.tech, right, we want to point to our virtual private server that we're hosting here. So I'm going to open this in a new tab. We want to point to this server that we have up and running. And doing that, we need to set up an A record that points to this domain or uses this domain as the name. So this is how we would specify the domain. So we can either add an @ or an @ pretty much means this. So in most of these panels, you can just add an @ for the root domain name. So let's add in an @ and then we want to point it to our server IP address. So to this IP address of our server. So this running virtual private server here, we want to take this IP address and we want to point to that IP address in our DNS record. And then the TTL, time to live, this is just default, just leave it like that, and we can add this record. So basically what this is doing, we've added a successful record to access our website through the postnet.tech domain name, and it will point towards our root server IP. And according to our domain setup on Dokku, that's just going to point to our front-end app. But we're going to change some things on the Dokku domain setup because we've changed to a domain name now instead of using our IP address. So we need to add 2 more domain names. The next, or not domain names, DNS records, so A records. So the next record is the API subdomain for this IP address. So we want to add a subdomain on top of this domain to access the API. So let's just add this A record. It's going to tell us that we're adding 2 A records pointing to the same content, which might be wrong, but we are using different subdomains. So this is just on the root domain, and this is on a subdomain of API. And then we're going to add one more subdomain, which is the www subdomain. So if someone were to access my domain just like this, or they would prefix it with a subdomain of www, it would both point to the front end. So let's add this one to confirm. So now we should have 3 A records. If we sort this, just do a refresh to get everything loaded properly. So if we sort this, we can see we now have 3 A records pointing to the same server IP address, but they have different names. This is on a subdomain of www, this is on the root domain, and this is on the API domain. So from our Dokku point of view, we need to configure it to work with these domains as well. So let's actually go ahead and do that now. So back in our server, let's go to our Dokku domains and let's just report that out. So currently our app's domains is using the server IP address, but we don't want to use the server IP address anymore. We want to actually set up the domains to use the ones we've set in the Hostinger panel. So we're going to say Dokku domains, and we're going to set up new domains for the Node API. And this domain is going to be called api.postnet.tech. So this is going to be the domain we want to point to our Node API. So when we access the api.post.net.tech, it is going to be routed from our DNS panel over here. We're going to take the API and it's going to go to our server. But we're hitting our server on the API subdomain. And then here we are setting up whenever there is an api.postnet.tech request coming in, it should be forwarded to the Node API. So doing this, we can see it is now setting up and it's reloading some Nginx configurations. So this is all good, but this is still not going to work because we have one missing config. We need to change the proxy config. So if we go to the Dokku proxy report and we view this, currently this port is mapping to the wrong HTTP port. We are not going to access it through a specific port anymore. When we access a website from a domain name, it is by default, when it's accessing through an HTTP connection, accessing your server through the port 80. So we need to actually change both of these to be port 80 and then map them to their required port. So this is going to stay the same because we want to point it to the underlying container ports, but it's going to all be coming in from the port 80. So let's configure that correctly. So we're going to say Dokku proxy and its ports set, and we want to change the API, the Node API, the HTTP, it should come from port 80 and map to port 3001. So doing this will set up our config, it will change the config and reload our Nginx configuration, and doing this for the next app as well. And then we need to point to port 3000, and this would set up our configs and reload Nginx as well. So let's just Dokku domains report to see that we've changed all of them. We haven't changed this one yet, so let's go ahead and change the next API domains. So Dokku domains set for the next app. There's going to be two domains. We're going to have the www.postnet.tech domain and then just the root domain of postnet.tech. So you can actually add multiple domains to point to the same app. So here we have one subdomain of www and then just the root domain. So adding this, once again, it would add these two configs to our env file and then restart the Nginx configuration. With this set up, we should be able to access our application on the domain name. There won't be any SSL certificates connected to it, but we'll get to that part now. Now we should be able to access it on our domain name. So let's go back to the website. Okay, so let's actually try and launch our application on the domain name. Okay, so we're visiting postnet.tech and we can see it has not propagated yet. Okay, so I'm actually just going to open an incognito tab and let's try and run it from here. But I want to access it on the HTTP port. Okay, here we can see it actually running. We do see our navbar and our about page, so we're able to navigate on our application. We do see an internal server error for the Node application, and we're going to look how we can inspect what's going on here in just a second. But the next thing we want to check is if the API is running on the subdomain. So let's say HTTP, and then we're going to go to the api.postnet.tech. Let's take a look, and we can see the API is running. So we now have our API and our front end running on their domain names and their subdomain with ease. So this is very, very cool. And here we can see all of our output of our JSON for this server. So this is not nicely formatted due to the incognito mode, but now we can see the server is running. So let's try and inspect why are we getting this error. So how do we go into our apps that we've created with Dokku and see the logs? How do we view what's going on inside of this application and why we're getting this internal error? So let's dive back to our terminal and let's log out. So we can use this Dokku logs command. So let's take a look at what we can do with this. There's a few commands. We have the failed report, set, vector logs, start logs, and stop logs. So a few useful stuff we can do, and then some we can use the tail command, we can use the quiet command or the process command, and then for the specific app. So let's actually log out our next app. So Dokku logs, and then we want to do this for the next app. And I want to add a tail of 15. So it's going to give us the live logs, but only 15 lines or so. So not next appy, just next app. Okay, and here we can see that we have our next logs. It's a little bit more than 15 lines, but it's going to keep on updating 15 lines at a time. So we see this error. So it's great. We can see why there is an error, and it's trying to access still on this URL. But remember, we've just changed our proxies, so we're not accepting anything on this port anymore. Neither are we accepting anything on this domain anymore. We are expecting the domain name. So one thing we need to do is actually close this up, and then we need to change the environment variable of our next app. So if we take a look at next config, or not next config, Dokku config, and the show command of the next app. Okay, we need to change this because this is not correct anymore. We're also not accepting HTTP. We're still accepting HTTP. So let's change that. So we're going to do the set command on the same app, and we want to set the port, or not the port, the next public API URL. So that's what we call the environment variable. We want to set this equals to HTTP and then the domain name. So API postnet.tech, just like this. So what this is going to do is it's actually going to restart our Docker container. It's going to redeploy this Docker container, but that's not going to update our environment variable change in our built Next.js app. We actually need to rebuild this Next.js process from the start. So how would we do this? Well, we can access our processes or our apps and call a rebuild using Dokku. And once this is done, I'll show you exactly how to do this. So we've done a redeploy, but if we go ahead and actually view the website again, and we do a refresh, we can see it's still giving us this 500 error. So nothing has changed. But let's actually rebuild our next app. So I'm going to say Dokku PS for the processes and call, let's just do the help. And we can see we have a few processes, commands we can use. So we're going to say Dokku PS, and we're going to use the rebuild command and rebuild the next app. And what this is going to do is it's going to start from the top. It's going to clean up everything. And the important thing, right, with Dokku is we have zero downtime. So if I'll go back to my application here and refresh, it's still going to respond to me, because although the deployment is happening in the background, it's not interfering with the current container running this application. As soon as the deployment is done, it just switches out the container seamlessly and ensuring that you have zero downtime on your websites or your services. So just another good use case and advantage of Dokku. So once this build is done for the front end, I'll get back to you again. Okay, so once again, we got to this part. So if we scroll up, this is the important part. It has added the build env environments again. So once we've set up this new environment, it got built. Here we're doing the final Next.js loading of the pages. So during this process, it actually connected to our database, successfully retrieved and built all of these pages. And now it's doing the caching of the build. So once this is done, we should be able to go and visit our application, and it should work. It should load the data from the database. And yeah, the next thing we're going to do is actually set up that SSL certificate to round off this video and the deployment. So you have a SSL certificate for visiting any of your endpoints on the domain. So we're almost there. I hope you found this video helpful thus far. If you did, give it a thumbs up, like and subscribe. Yeah, let's actually wait for this to continue. Almost done, build succeeded. Now it's going to do some of the default countdowns to ensure that you have this 100% uptime. Okay, so here we can see the Nginx is reloading. The deployment is basically complete. It's running the post-deployment scripts. And here we're switching out the containers. We can see we're renaming containers and switching it out. And we can now access it on the domain. So let's actually go ahead and do that. Let's go to the website, do a refresh and see if everything is working now. And we have success. We can see our application loading. Once again, on the domain, this is very exciting. we can access it on the different domains. Okay, so let's actually try out the delete functionality. Oh, and we can see it's not deleting. So let's inspect this and figure out what's going on here. So take the network request and we can delete it, and we see the dreaded CORS error. And the reason this CORS error is happening is because we don't have set up we have not set up an origin on our API to allow for this domain. So we've set it up to allow for HTTPS domains to work, but not for HTTP only domains. So let's actually finish this off by setting up the HTTPS domain so we can access it through without incognito mode. So let's actually go ahead and do that quickly. Okay, so in order for us to set up SSL certificates on our domains, we will be using another plugin for Dokku called Dokku Let's Encrypt. So once again, we just visit Dokku Let's Encrypt GitHub page where we get this installation link. Once again, using the Dokku plugin command, and then we're installing Let's Encrypt. So let's head over to our terminal and paste in this command, let it run, and we can see it's downloading some Docker images again, and we are configuring Let's Encrypt plugin. So once this is done, running the Dokku command, we should see another entry under the plugins. So let's zoom out a little bit here, and we can see we now have two community plugins, Let's Encrypt and Postgres. So now let's use Let's Encrypt. So this is going to make everything so easy. We just say Dokku Let's Encrypt, and let's take a look at what it gives to us. We have activate, auto renew, clean up, cron jobs, disable, enable, and set and enable. So this is the important one. We're going to enable Let's Encrypt. So enables or renews a Let's Encrypt for an app. So Let's Encrypt basically gives us SSL certificates, and we are able to renew it and set it up with Dokku Let's Encrypt plugin. So let's say Dokku Let's Encrypt and enable it for a specific app, so the Node API. So this is going to tell us we first need to provide an email to set up our Let's Encrypt. So in my previous video where I did this the bare bone way, right, from scratch using Nginx and Let's Encrypt, downloading it from source, you also had to set up your email. So in order to set up your email, we can use this command. I'm just going to copy it from up here and then paste it down below. Remove this and add in an email. So we're going to have the FULLSTACKJUNKIE@gmail.com. And adding this will once again just set this email, and then I can run the Let's Encrypt enable command. And now it's going to enable, it's going to run a few things, and it's going to fetch and create and generate a Let's Encrypt certificate for the Node API app based on all of our configurations. So you can see it actually retrieved the certificate successfully, and it created our new Dokku port mapping to allow for HTTPS on the specific port 443, and it points to the port 3001. So with this done, we now have set up SSL certificates for our API subdomain. So api.postnet.tech now has an SSL certificate configured, and we want to try and add it for the back or for the front end. So Dokku Let's Encrypt. So we're going to need to set up that email again. So I'm just going to up arrow key. Here's the email, but we want to set this up for the next app. Okay, and then we want to do the Dokku Let's Encrypt enable for the next app as well. So once again, it's just going to take the domain configurations that we've set up and the proxy configurations that we've set up, and it's going to resolve that with our HTTPS configuration. So when we get our SSL certificate, it kind of takes our certificate and it sets up all of these new port mappings for HTTPS as well. So it does a lot of Nginx things automatically behind the scenes for us. So with this done, let's actually go back to our website and let's try and access it now. So I'm going to say postnet.tech, and we can access our application, and we can see this lock icon. So we have SSL protected and it's HTTPS. So here we can access our project. Let's view the API subdomain, postnet.tech, postnet.tech. and it's on the SSL certificate, and we can see API is running. If we view the posts, we see all of the posts being logged out. So now we have deployed our full stack application to the cloud using Hostinger and Dokku. We've set up domain names, we've set up subdomains, and we've connected it with our front end. So let's actually test everything out. We're still not able to delete some applications, it seems. So let's inspect, not view page source. Let's inspect what's going on here in the API logs. Let's see, we have all 10 of our posts, and refresh here. We have all 10 of our posts. Now we want to delete one. So let's go to the network logs and delete this post. And we're getting blocked requests. So it's trying still to access it on this URL. So it still hasn't, we haven't updated to HTTPS yet. So this is why it's being blocked, right? So it's trying to access HTTPS application is making an HTTP request. So it needs to make a HTTPS request as well for it to work. So let's just change that config and rebuild our application. So Dokku, we're getting some practice here, right? So Dokku, it's configs. So config and then set for the next app. I'm typing so bad. Next app, we want to change the next public API URL, and we want to change this to HTTPS of the api.postnet.tech. And this is going to once again do this rebuild. We can actually add a flag to say no restart because it's just restarting our application. So it's doing a redeploy. But we can actually skip this if we added a flag of -- no restart. But I didn't do that now. So once this is done, we just need to rebuild our Docker container in order to take this new updated configuration variable into account. So let's do that. We can say Dokku ps rebuild the next app, and let's take a look. So this is once again going to take some time. So once this is done, I'll get back to you. Okay, so this build is almost complete. Now we're at the page generation part of Next.js again. So once you've seen this in action, right, you kind of see it's repetitive steps the whole time. So using tools like Dokku, there are plenty other tools like Dokku. We have Terraform and you can use Heroku and Vercel themselves, but understanding what's happening behind the scenes kind of makes it easy to work with your applications and configure and play around. So this is the method I use to deploy most of my applications, and it's been working out pretty good for me thus far. So a nice thing that I will show you in an upcoming video in this series is how we can connect this with something like GitHub Actions to start doing our deployments automatically as we do version control with GitHub. So that's going to be a very interesting video. So I hope to see you in that video. But as we get to the end here, we can see it's caching the build and the build was succeeded. Now it's going to start up our web processes and switch out the containers. So once this is done, I will jump back in again. Okay, we're doing our wait. So close. Once this is done, we have a launched full stack application. This is crazy, guys. I hope you feel achieved. If you followed with me during this video, I hope everything worked out perfectly. If you missed something or you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I'll jump in and try and help where I can. So let's go back to the browser and actually inspect our application this time. So let's do a refresh. And everything is still up. Our API is still up. We see all the posts. So let's actually try and delete a post now. And we can see that post was deleted. If we go to the API, we see no longer there's a post 1. So if I try and find post 1, we get an error, nothing was found. So our full stack application is deployed. Let's try and just test everything. Let's edit it. The updated text, you can see it's updated. Let's delete everything else from the API. Let's play around, do some deleting. And then let's actually go and inspect our logs on the API as well for all of these deletes and creations and edits. Because during our API build, new post, we've added in Morgan to show some logging. So here we are deleting all the posts and no posts are found. If we go to the API and refresh all posts, we can see there's an empty array and a count of 0. So let's, for last's sake, let's take a look at our Dokku logs, and we're going to log out the Node API with a tail of 15. Okay, and here we can see all of the logs happening, the delete requests, the get of the post that was not found, and everything being logged out. So yeah, that is it from me. I hope you found this video entertaining and insightful, and I hope you can go ahead and test this out on your applications for future deployments. And yeah, that's it for me in this video, and I'll see you in the next one.